Section 3. In this section, we will discuss the process used to analyze and rate risks. Attendees will learn about the risk analysis process and rating the risks. We learned in the previous sections that you will analyze risks by the impact of the risk to the likelihood of the occurrence. Impact may include any of these items, but impact is ultimately the estimate of the harm that could be caused by an event. Impact may be rated from low to high based on the estimated amount of harm that could occur to the environment, safety, health, security, mission, cost, or various other business factors. Likelihood is the probability that an event will occur. Some items are more likely to be counterfeit, fraudulent, or suspect, since they have been historically and continue to be targeted by counterfeiters. These include obsolete components, difficult to procure items, items where lead times are critical, items where multiple versions are available, items where there is a high volume but low price, or vice versa, and common commercial items, items of strategic value, etc. An organization can approach analyzing risks in different ways, and it should be tailored to the organization's specific needs. This chart is an example of a methodology for counterfeit risk analysis. Once risks are rated and understood, it is often easier to propose and identify controls. As an example, if you had an item that you determined to have a high impact to your organization and a high likelihood as a risk rating, you may be able to determine specific measures or controls for this rating. What might create a higher likelihood for an item to be counterfeit, fraudulent, or suspect? You can pause the video to discuss as a team or continue. Answers might include obsolescence, supplier choice, multiple versions, volume, cost, strategic value. Blank is the estimate of harm that could be caused by an event. Again, pause to gather any answers from a team or for yourself. Impact is the answer to number 2. And number 3, blank is the probability that an event will occur. Again, pause the video to gather any answers. Likelihood is the answer to number 3, is the probability. Continuing with section 4, assess the risks, processes, and controls. In this section, we will discuss what the gap and risk assessment processes are, and attendees will learn about these processes and how they may be used. Performing a gap analysis and risk assessment helps organizations to understand and correct disparities between desired levels and actual levels of performance. Identify inadequate controls, such as inadequate or missing procedures, processes, or policies. This could also be inadequate training or physical controls used in systems to prevent human error. Identifying trends that require additional controls. This is analyzed by someone who has the capability to understand the data sets and evaluate the data to determine if there are any overarching issues that should be addressed in policy or even with the addition of a physical control. A physical control could be adding a stop in a procurement system that will not allow purchasers to proceed without adding a counterfeit, fraudulent, or suspect items clause to a contract. This mistake proofs the process so that it is always added when it needs to be. Physical controls should be assessed frequently and on a defined schedule to verify that they are working correctly. Continually improving processes is very important. Even if all trends are pointing towards everything is looking good, it is always good to assess processes and verify that they are working properly. Interview workers and see if processes are being used or followed the way that they are supposed to, or if adjustments need to be made based on their feedback. There is always room to improve processes and controls. A gap analysis which may also be referred to as a needs analysis, is important for any type of organizational performance. It allows companies to determine where they are today and where they want to be in the future. Companies can re examine their goals through a gap analysis to figure out whether they are on the right track to accomplishing them. Ultimately, the goal of any gap analysis is to identify areas of improvement and potential risks that may affect operations. The main purpose of a risk assessment is to eliminate or reduce operational risks, like threats and vulnerabilities, and improve the overall safety of the workplace. A risk assessment is used to identify and prioritize risks so actions can be taken to mitigate them. It is important to perform and renew risk assessments when starting a new project, introducing new processes or steps into workflows, changing existing processes, and when new hazards are identified or arise due to other changes. The risk assessment process may also review policies and management decisions on risks and communication efforts, such as how information is exchanged involving risks. What do you think is the main difference between a gap analysis and a risk assessment? You can pause the video to gather any answers. A potential answer here is the goal of the gap analysis is to identify areas of improvement and potential risks that could influence or negatively impact operations, whereas a risk assessment aims to identify and prioritize risks so actions can be taken to mitigate them. So, why perform a gap and risk analysis? A gap and risk assessment can help you identify gaps in your policies, procedures, or compliance controls and evaluate what remediation your organization will need to employ in order to mitigate newly identified or internal and external risks. These two really work well together. A blank analysis evaluates the current state against the future desired state. Pause to gather any answers to the question. The answer to number one is gap, a gap analysis. Number two, a blank assessment identifies hazards. Pause again to gather any answers. And the answer to number two is risk, or a risk assessment identifies hazards. All right, on to section 5, which is mitigate. In this section, we will review concepts to mitigate counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items. And hopefully, attendees will understand this process better after reviewing this section. In the previous sections, we have discussed risk planning, which addressed in detail risk identification, risk rating, and risk assessment. In this next section, we will be reviewing in more depth the risk plan of action, which is where we mitigate the risks we have identified, rated, and assessed. Risk mitigation is the action you take to reduce threats and ensure resiliency. When you mitigate risk, you are taking steps to reduce adverse effects. It is important to remember that mitigating risk is not just about fixing vulnerabilities, it's about reducing the impact of any potential threats. When developing a mitigation strategy, it is important to consider how your organization will react if something bad happens, as well as how you can prevent negative events from happening now and in the future. When mitigating risk, develop a strategy that closely relates to and matches your organization's profile. This is very crucial. A proper mitigation strategy will define how you manage risks. We discussed in the previous sections a risk planning process and strategy that may be used. There are 5 main risk mitigation strategies that are commonly used in business, which include risk acceptance, avoidance, reduction, transference, and sharing. Risk acceptance does not reduce any effects. However, it is still considered a risk strategy. The strategy is a common option when the cost of other risk management options, such as avoidance or limitation, such as reduction, outweigh the cost of the risk itself. A company that doesn't want to spend a lot of money on avoiding risks that do not have a high possibility or impact in occurring will use the risk acceptance strategy. An example of risk acceptance could be that the organization creates a holistic process for reporting counterfeit and fraudulent and suspect items, but there really isn't any explicit prevention or detection being performed or processes for these types of actions. Risk avoidance is the opposite of risk acceptance. It is the action that avoids any exposure to the risk whatsoever. It's important to note that risk avoidance is usually the most expensive of all risk mitigation options. An example of this is that the organization may avoid the risk of counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items by refraining from using certain technologies that are vulnerable to being counterfeit or minimizing its usage. Additionally, it could be avoiding the use of specific suppliers or manufacturers and only buying from specific manufacturers or authorized distributors. Risk reduction is the most common risk management strategy used by most businesses. This strategy reduces a company's exposure to risk by taking actions. It is a strategy employing a bit of risk acceptance along with a bit of risk avoidance, or an average of both. An example of risk reduction would be a company accepting that a disk drive may fail and then avoiding a long period of failure by having backups. Another risk reduction example could be that an organization may invest in inspections and tests for items. Inspectors may be trained on counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect item identification, and acquisition personnel may also be trained on prevention and use of prevention methods during the acquisition process. All of these things will reduce the likelihood of counterfeits and fraudulent and suspect items. Therefore, exposure to that risk is reduced. Risk transference is handing risk over to a willing third party. This is often completed by means of a contract. And, why might an organization transfer risk? There's maybe a couple of different reasons, but it could be to transfer liability to that third party, to transfer risk in areas where the organization may not be an expert. Maybe they're not an expert in payroll or other services, to transfer operations or processes that may aid in continuity of operations in the event of a natural disaster or other supply chain risks, such as what occurred during the pandemic. An example of risk transference is an organization may choose to transfer some of the risks of counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items by having a third party conduct audits of a supplier for counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items, or having them conduct inspections or tests, or acquisition operations in which that company may not be a subject matter expert in. So, what are some examples of risk transference? Additional examples. These include contract clauses for counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items, insurance policies, which may not be applicable always in this case, but definitely extended warranties, other things of that could be. So, risk sharing occurs when responsibility for risk assumed by one organization can be shared with another. Although this method may not eliminate the risk, it may reduce the risk to an acceptable level. Organizations with different risk tolerance levels may be able to use risk sharing to align responsibility for different types of risk with the commensurate risk tolerance levels, and to assign responsibility for specific types of risk to organizations with the appropriate expertise or resources to address them. So, what's the difference between risk sharing and risk transference? Is that risk transference is the strategy of financing your risk by shifting the responsibility and loss to another person or organization for a price, usually conducted through a contract of some sort. Whereas risk sharing is dividing risks between two or more individuals or organizations. So, what's an example of risk sharing? These could include agreements to share resources or expertise, such as during a design phase of a project. This could be sharing policies, procedures, processes for counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect item prevention and detection. Good risk sharing approaches normally will combine agreements for cost sharing on preventative and deterrent measures. The policies allow for inclusion of costs and budgets and the contribution agreements themselves, and agreements on how to deal with residual accepted risks should they materialize. Agreements on organizations' responses to identifying, reporting, and potentially disposing of counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items. So, just as a review, we went through identifying the risks, rating by likelihood and impact, assessing risks, and then mitigating risks. In this scenario, scenario number one, we have identified a risk on our risk list in which the part is obsolete and is no longer available from the manufacturer or their distributors. You'll be performing the risk rating on this item and consider how likely is it that your organization will receive a counterfeit, fraudulent, suspect item since the part is obsolete and no longer available from the manufacturer? And what might be the impact? When performing a risk assessment, you determined that there is a current obsolescence management process in place for your organization, but not for this specific project. Typically, your organization would require a design refresh and replace parts that are obsolete or end of life every 10 years. But this is out of cycle, and it has only been 5 years since the original design was released. The project staff will have decided to move forward with procuring the obsolete and end of life products from sources that may still have them in stock since the items were recently discontinued in the last year. 100% inspection will be required to be performed, including tests specific to identify counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items issues on the items. For the risk plan of action, do you think that the risks are being accepted, avoided, reduced, transferred, or shared? And do you think that this is enough? You can pause here to discuss with the team as needed. In this analysis, we have determined that the risk has a high likelihood and moderate impact. Mitigations that are suggested for this likelihood and impact are to transfer, share, and reduce the risks. So, what is a method we might use to transfer risk? Up and pause here to discuss with your team if doing training as a team. A potential answer is that contracts are used to transfer risk to third parties. This might include a counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect item clause, which also includes an indemnity clause. What is a method we might use to share risk? Again, pause to discuss as a team. A potential answer is to remember sharing risk is different than transferring risk in that it is more of an agreement than a paid contractual obligation between the organizations. Some risk sharing techniques could include having a common set of standards or processes for your counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect item prevention, detection, reporting, disposition, etc. This is especially useful if multiple agencies or organizations will be performing work on the same project. What is a method we might use to reduce risk? Again, pause the video to discuss if taking training as a team. A potential answer is that inspections and tests may be used to reduce the risk of using or installing a counterfeit, fraudulent, or suspect item. Additionally, supplier audits and assessments may be performed to determine if the supplier has processes to prevent counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items at their facility. Scenario number two: an individual is planning to procure an item that has no associated environment, safety, health, or security risks. The item is also low cost and would have minimal impact to operations if it were to fail. This could be listed as little to no risk. For the risk rating, you will consider: how likely is it that your organization will receive a counterfeit, fraudulent, or suspect item? Has there been any previous issues with supplier or part, other reports, etc.? What might be the impact? Will the item pose a hazard to the environment, safety of workers, or public health? Will the item pose a significant impact to operations, reputation, or project success? For the risk planning actions, you will consider if the risks will be accepted, avoided, reduced, transferred, or shared. Since we identified in this scenario that the item was low cost and had no identified risk to environment, safety, health, or security, it would likely be considered low impact. For likelihood, we might consider the supply source and if any nonconformance, substandard, or counterfeit, fraudulent, or suspect item issues had been experienced before with the source. This could raise the likelihood of receiving a counterfeit, fraudulent, or suspect item from low to moderate or high. In this case, let's assume the supply source is directly from a manufacturer or their authorized distributor, and that the source has been reliable in the past. So we will score this at low likelihood. For the risk mitigation, we will accept the risks because the risks are low. What does it mean to accept the risks? Go ahead and pause the video if conducting training as a team. A potential answer is accepting the risks means that the organization may not be able to perform or may choose not to perform preventative or detection actions, but there may still be a process in place to address counterfeit, fraudulent, suspect items that are identified during the course of regular work processes by staff. This could be a reporting process. Now we are starting off at section 6. In this section, we'll review planning concepts that will aid in counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect item prevention. Hopefully, after this section, attendees will understand how to perform planning to aid in better prevention processes. Upfront planning prevents counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items, including software. Planning may start at the project planning stage using a defined graded approach and should consider what major procurements will be conducted during the project, will critical items be procured, and what steps, if any, should be included to reduce potential risks of counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items. A key component of planning is to understand the risks and their controls. The integrity of systems and information is a critical component of managing supply chain and cybersecurity risks. Prior to procurement, processes such as project planning or design processes should consider the bill of materials, how items will be used, criticality of items, and their associated risks, tests that may be needed, and customer defined specifications. It is vital at the procurement step that requirements are well understood and communicated to suppliers, and that contracts properly document requirements. This is especially true when procuring items that will be used in a more critical capacity. When preventing counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items, it is incredibly important we create processes to understand and mitigate the risks of counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items. What are some of the risks that these items pose, and how can these risks be mitigated? We should also work to understand best practices by capturing our internal organization practices, but also look externally to other organizations for learning. Are there elements that we have not thought of in our own organization or that we have not experienced? What did they do to prevent an incident or event from occurring? We should always foster an environment and culture where prevention is important versus reaction. This one is huge. Organizations may know that prevention is too difficult, so they rely on inspection to get the job done. And this can be especially true in counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect item processes. There may be instances where there is not enough or there is not an option, and processes such as commercial dedication, when we're referring to internationally recognized standards such as American Society of Mechanical Engineered Nuclear Quality Assurance or NQA1 were to be used. There's still much effort that may be utilized to prevent the use of substandard suppliers or manufacturers. We must always also improve processes continually and verify processes and procedures match our level of work. Assessment planning. It is important when planning for acquisitions that we determine who will perform assessments. Often, some sort of assessment of the supplier should occur, even if it is informal. An informal assessment may be conducted by the acquisition office to verify that the supplier address is valid or that the business itself is valid. Assessments may also include trending or analyzing supplier past performance data. This could be reviewing information such as nonconformances, counterfeit, fraudulent, or suspect item complaints, on time delivery, etc., which could all point to concerns with using a supplier or potential supplier risks. More formalized, on site, or other types of desk assessments may be conducted by internal auditors or assessors by using third party auditors or assessors that are external to your organization. Formal assessments will be performed using industry or nationally recognized acceptance standards. Desk assessments may be alternatives to on site assessments and were more popularized during the pandemic as another way to assess suppliers and manufacturers when travel was restricted. This type of assessment may validate processes and procedures, but may not fully validate them against performance of the processes. Third party assessments may also be performed by consultants. Assessments may be required or could be ideal by independent organizations or third parties when there could be conflict of interest concerns, where there could be biases present, or when there is already a contract in place that may be altered, reduced in funds, or could be stopped due to counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items issues. Contract clauses. Understanding and defining when or what contract clauses are applicable is a very important aspect to prevention and may also be an important aspect if a counterfeit, fraudulent, or suspect item is identified at your organization. Contract clauses are often what is used during civil liability cases to determine if funds may be recouped. This could be a huge factor if the cost of the product is significant, property damage, or injuries were incurred due to the counterfeit or fraudulent suspect item. Poorly written contract language can also be a get out of jail free card in many instances. It is always recommended that your organization work closely with legal counsel to determine the appropriate level of language to include in your clause for the type of work you do or the products you are procuring. Specifications and requirements. Specifications and requirements may be added into a contract clause, statement of work, or other document that will define to the supplier the standards to be followed. Internal processes or procedures may define who is responsible for defining specifications, requirements on acquisitions, or at a minimum, validating them prior to sending contracts to the supplier. This is the roadmap for the supplier to provide the right item. If this is incorrect, then the item is likely going to be incorrect and it won't be the supplier's fault. I cannot tell you how many times I have had someone bring me an item that was non-conforming and they wanted to back charge the supplier. But when I looked at the contract, I found the item met the contractual requirements. Risk identification. How is risk identified and controlled specifically for the acquisition? Is this a documented process? Are you using strategies for documenting and mitigating risks, such as what was previously discussed? And acceptance is the process of ensuring that items meet requirements and specifications and that they will be usable for their intended purpose. What inspection processes will be performed? Are there any special considerations? Consider inspection processes such as source inspections. Acceptance testing may take place at the supplier or purchaser's facility. Third party laboratory testing and inspections. Acceptance could be performed by a third party, such as a laboratory that conducts specialized testing. And receipt inspections. Your organization may use a defined graded approach to inspect items or other inspections, such as in process, final, inventory, packaging, shipping inspection, etc. And what might be included as verification in your inspections? Will these be informal or formalized based on a graded approach or risk based approach as defined by your organization? This was also previously discussed in the risk mitigation sections. But what will be included as verification steps? Will these steps use a graded approach? Is your organization using sampling or 100% verification? And does your organization consider history of previous counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect item concerns with the supplier or in general, and risk of the item, safety and security, and supplier past performance could include nonconformance issues? What are some elements that might be considered to prevent counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items that we just discussed? Pause the video to discuss as a team if needed. Some potential answers could be procurement planning, clauses, supplier assessment and on site inspection, personnel and supplier training. This could also be inspection planning. Questions should be directed at the individual who posted this training or any training coordinators. Thank you very much. There's also references and resources that were used throughout this training to develop it.